The return of great power politics and the question whether we are already in World War III is the topic of today's Hammer Time. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves, given that the year is coming to a close, is whether or not the changes over the last 12 months have truly indicated that we have entered a new stage of global politics. I believe the answer to this is yes. That the reliability of a world due to globalization, due to economic integration, was more or less on autopilot over the last, well, let's say during the 90s and early 2000s, even despite events like 9/11, that back in the day seemed to be such significant events. And of course, they were significant, but they didn't really shatter the global architecture in the same way as events, I would say, over the last 4 years, 4.5 years, have made changes. So the question I'm asking is, are we already in World War III, or are we at least in the foothills of a new Cold War that could potentially turn into a hot war? In the future, historians will ask, okay, when was the begin of this new global conflict? And I guess some would say it was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Others would say it was Vladimir Putin's speech during the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he defined red lines from the Russian perspective. Others might say it was the annexation of Crimea or the global financial crisis in 2008, which really in a sustainable way shattered the illusion that the global financial and economic system is built on a solid foundation. Now, whichever one of those states it's ultimately going to be, I think the idea that the global economy and that the global structure is in a process of change can no longer be denied. One of the first things that we have to look at when we speak about this change is the question, who are the drivers of this change? Or to put it slightly differently, who has agency? And I think this is a key question. So who has both the power and the will to shape future events, and who is going to be shaped by future events? And I think this is a crucial question. I very often like to compare it to two people playing a game of chess. So we all know that the two people sitting in front of each other, they are the ones who play the game. But then, of course, you have the chess pieces on the field, and they are the ones who are being played. And the big question for every nation, for every country, for every alliance in the world at the moment is, are you among those who sit at the table and play the game, or are you among those who are pieces on the board? And I think at the moment it is fair to assess that actual players are the United States, Russia, China, to some extent I would say India, and maybe a handful of others. Turkey comes to mind, maybe some players in North Africa and the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, at least partially, and a few others. And then there are those who, at the moment at least, appear to be the pieces on the chessboard. Among them, I would count the European Union and most of the European states. The big problem we see emanating from Brussels, but also in European capitals, is that although there are many platitudes and a lot of rhetoric, very often these are not supported by both geopolitical, economic, diplomatic, and industrial realities. Now, we talk very often in the pages of Brussels Signal and on this podcast about the economic shortcomings, the democratic shortcomings, the political shortcomings within the European Union. But these were issues that, at least for a certain amount of time, could be neglected. As long as the economy was roaring along, as long as living standards were at least not declining, right, the role of being, some would say, a vassal to the United States, but let's say the role of being a non or minor player in geopolitics was something that could be ignored. That is no longer the case. And what is particularly frustrating is, if we look at the timeline, we can say that already in 2007, there were the first indicators that something is going to change. And I'm just using this as an example. As always, it happens very rarely that history truly condenses itself into singular events. But I think it was quite remarkable in 2007, in February, at the Munich Security Conference, when Vladimir Putin made quite clear that there are certain red lines, like, for example, NATO expansion into Ukraine, was a red line from the perspective of Moscow, that it would make Europe less secure and that it would be a violation of Russia's core interests. Now, let me make one point absolutely clear, because very often when we have debates about geopolitics, there is this idea that it is primarily a moral question. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any moral questions, but I'm saying that moral questions are very often separate, or that they're very hard to be aligned with, let's say, the brute realities of economics, of international politics, of national interests. And I want to give you a very quick historical example that I think highlights this quite nicely. In recent days, we very often hear during these negotiations about a potential ceasefire and maybe even a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, we hear that there cannot be any territorial concessions because you shall never reward an aggressor. Again, from a moral perspective, I think that is a true statement. From a political perspective, I think it is just untenable. And historically, this is not how things ever worked. I give you a concrete example that is very often forgotten. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union were clearly rewarded after World War II for their aggression against the Baltic states, against Eastern Europe, even Central Asia, and other areas as well. Right? One could argue that, well, the Soviet Union fought Nazi Germany. That is true. But does fighting Nazi Germany really justify the occupation and annexation of the Baltic states? Did it really justify that Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania were under permanent Russian influence, that they were more or less Russian puppets, despite uprisings by the people? Eastern Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, the Czech Republic, or back then Czechoslovakia, 1968. Why is it that we continued to deepen economic relations with China despite their annexation of Tibet? Why is it that we had still negotiations, at least in the recent past, with Turkey about potential EU membership, and of course as an important NATO member, despite their invasion of Northern Cyprus in the 1970s? So history shows us that, unfortunately, very often, if there are other geopolitical considerations, we do reward aggressors. And this has happened in the past, and I'm afraid it's going to happen in the present, it's going to happen in the future again. Now the question then is this reward worth whatever you get out of it on the other end? And as it happens so often, we have to concede that at the moment, Europe in particular is, to go back to my previous analogy, we are not a player. We are a piece on the board. So what we now need primarily is time. We need time to restructure our economies. We need time to take care of domestic issues. We need time, apparently, to prepare both our political but also our social and cultural elites that we have entered a new phase of global politics. Unless this is going to happen, right, all these platitudes, all these political announcements are useless. And another step is to accept that in the past, great power politics has never lasted stage. Let me give you a quick timeline of the so-called color revolutions that took place in the past. And I immediately want to add, before I go into these color revolutions, that one of the big problems you have in the contemporary political debate is this idea that every event can only have one causal factor. So it's factor A that caused B. It's factor B that caused C. But very often, it's a mixture of different factors that leads to different outcomes. I think this is particularly important about these so-called color revolutions, from what happened in Yugoslavia in the early 90s, but then, of course, also in the late 90s and early 2000s, what happened with the Rose Revolution in Georgia, with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, with the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, then with the attempted so-called Jeans Revolution in Belarus, and of course then, which all of it led then to the emergence of the BRICS states, as you can see it on this graph. Now, what is important here is that it is neither true, as some critics say, that all these revolutions were only exclusively caused by Western interventionism, just as it is not true that those who say it had nothing to do with Western interventionism. It's a mixture of both. Of course, there were movements in Serbia, in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, in Ukraine, who wanted to get closer to the West, who wanted to orient their policies towards something resembling more of, let's frame it as a liberal representative democracy. So many of these movements that were then, which is also true, supported financially and otherwise by US aid, by NGOs, always sometimes even openly by Western governments. Those things are not mutually exclusive. But it is, of course, also true that from the perspective of Russia, from the perspective of China and others, this was seen as Western interference in their periphery, in states in which they argued and believed that they have a very specific interest. Now, let me be very clear here. Whether or not we say that this view is justified is a separate issue to saying this is a view that they have, right? This is a view you have to take into account when you deal with them. Why am I saying this? The United States, and I mentioned this in another podcast about the so-called Don Roe doctrine, the United States is now pursuing what can only be described as a neo-imperialist policy in the Western Hemisphere. Right? If pro-American candidates and politicians, Javier Milei, are propped up, they are supported financially, they are supported by means of propaganda, they are supported by providing liquidity, which again, fine by me. I think this is what great power politics has always done. We see, on the other hand, Venezuela, Mexico, right? If your policies are not in line with American interests, the US are not shy of attempting and announcing a policy that is tantamount to attempted regime change. Venezuela, I think, is the big elephant in the room, and we're itching ever closer to an open policy of regime change there. Now, the argument from the US side will be, we see this as our sphere of interest. Right? This is, as the saying went in the past, it's the backyard of the United States, so therefore they have more rights than others to intervene there. Now, I don't think that they have more a right to do so. I think they have more capabilities to do so. I would argue from a moral perspective that this is wrong, right? Every state should have agency on their own. Nobody should tell them what they have to do. But reality tends to be different, right? As I said before, this is a nice idea, this idea that all states are treating each other as equal. So that Switzerland and Russia, that Sweden and the United States, that they're all basically the same and they all respect each other to the same extent. This is never how politics worked. This is not how it worked under the so-called liberal world order. And this is not how it has worked at any time. We were very good in telling ourselves that it did, and thereby sometimes ignoring when things were different. As I said, Serbia is an example. The intervention in the Middle East. Like all these cases where in the past the West has intervened and kind of broken their own promise of a quote-unquote liberal world order. Now, we then tell ourselves, well, this was morally justified. And maybe these interventions were morally justified. That's a separate discussion. But they were still interventions under the supposed pursuit of the national interest, or if you want, the broader interest of quote-unquote the West. As I always say, whether these interventions were justified or not, I'm happy to have this discussion another day. My point is that the policy of interventionism never stopped. We just told ourselves in the West that when the other side does it, it's interventionism. When we do it, it's human rights. So when we do it, it's morally so well intended that it's not really the same thing. And as I said, you can make this argument, but I think in reality, this is not how it was perceived in other places in the world. And it cannot be denied that whatever one thinks about these color revolutions, if you then have Western politicians, American politicians, traveling to these countries and standing side by side with the revolutionaries, this is a pretty clear statement. We would, I think at least, we would find it quite surprising if, let's say, a right-wing party, or we would be very critical if a right-wing party that is despised by the establishment would win an election, and then politicians from China would travel to said European country to be pictured congratulating those politicians. We would immediately say, well, this is interference. This is, foreign interference in European elections. Absolutely, right? This could be an argument. And the same argument, of course, can be made if you have members of US Congress going to Kiev, going to other places, congratulating, well, either whether it will be the members of the Orange Revolution or the members of the Rose Revolutions or other one of those movements. Now, as I said, right, it's important to keep in mind that actions have consequences. And it is also important to keep in mind whether or not you or I agree with these policies or agree with these, let's say, actions is only secondary to the question of how does the other side perceive it? Because in successful diplomacy and international politics, it is not just important to look at the world as I would like it to be. It is also important to look at the world as the other side perceives it. Even if I disagree, right? There's a difference between acknowledging somebody's different worldview and approving of their worldview. So I can always make the case that while I do not approve of Russia's actions or the motivation behind their actions, I can acknowledge that they made quite clear in the past that the kind of events that then unfolded starting in 2022 became more likely due to certain, again, whether we accepted those red lines or not, but kind of the not taking into account the supposed Russian interest in Ukraine, and particularly the eastern areas of Ukraine. As I said, and I will not grow tired of mentioning this again and again and again, this is not a justification. This is not an attempt to make light of the human suffering or to make light of any war. But my argument is, if we take into account consciously the perspective of the other side, I think we can always come to an outcome where war can be avoided. Very often wars are a consequence of a misunderstanding. Not always, but very often. And even if I do not agree or approve what the other side has to say, I think I have to take it into account. And there has been a tendency, particularly on part of the West, and I say this as a supporter of the West, as you know, I live in Europe, right? As a fan of the West, I say that I think we have been a little bit blind towards the ideas, the concepts, the worldviews of other states in the past. And as I said, right, acknowledging that others see the world differently is not the same as approving their worldview. But in international politics, in diplomacy, it is important to take the other person's view into account. Another thing that happened, if we go even a few steps further back, is the great financial crisis of 2008. And I think that is still a little bit of an underestimated or underappreciated phenomenon, because I would say that future historians will say, well, this was the time when the trust in the dollar-based economy, or kind of the US-centric global economy, was starting to erode. Some would say it started in the 1970s with the end of the gold standard, and I think that's fair. But I would say that during the 90s, there kind of was a little bit of a more relaxed approach, and there was the idea that the United States are a somewhat responsible steward, if you want, of the global economy, or at least the global financial system. But I think this has ended in 2008. And we can see kind of shifts in the behavior of certain states. Russia, for example, started to move out of US treasuries and into gold. We see certain shifts in the Chinese financial system and their setup. We see that in 2009, right? The real emergence, I think there's still quite the way to go, but we see the more and more significant emergence as coordination among the BRIC states. As I said, I think that from being a group of like-minded states to be truly a unified actor, if you want, comparable to the EU or NATO or something of that weight, is still a way to go, but we can see the beginning of it. And this, of course, is quite crucial for the things that are going to happen in the future. Because the idea of the liberal world order was always that it is a world order that is primarily shouldered by the United States. And even, by the way, I think the United States themselves have decided that this is no longer in their interest. Now, I already mentioned the move by Donald Trump towards this attempted integration of the Western Hemisphere into a US-centric, if you want, integrated economic sphere. Now, what this means is not necessarily the emergence of what is very often called multipolarity, but I think it means that by neo-imperial means, the United States are building a power base in their close periphery. And others will then be offered the option to join. But this, of course, means that if you join the US, you cannot join anybody else. So the kind of policy that was possible, particularly for countries like Germany and others, that you can have equally productive, although on the long run suicidal, relations with the Chinese and the United States and others, I think that is over. There will be pressure to pick a side. The question then which side is going to be picked remains to be seen. And this is something I want to start also with this podcast. I believe that this is the kind of conversation we need to have. We have to become, and it pains me to say this, we have to become more cynical. We are, as the topic of today's podcast says, we are at the beginning of either a new Cold War that could then become, in the worst scenario, a third World War. Now, preparing ourselves for the worst while hoping for the best, I believe, is the prudent way to move forward. But this would also mean that we take into account many of the things that we have ignored for way too long. European industrial policy, particularly due to things like the Green New Deal, is no longer on par with the demands by current geopolitics. You cannot deindustrialize. You cannot lose manufacturing. You cannot lose know-how. You cannot lose the sources of innovation and believe that you can be a player on an equal footing like China and the US. And I'm not going to do the usual routine of mocking the EU bureaucracy and mocking Brussels, because we do this all the time in our own bubble. I think it is more important to say there are still hidden strengths in Europe. I do not think that it is not 5 past 12, it's 5 to 12. We have companies like ASML, right? We have interesting pharmaceutical companies. We have small hidden champions, but the situation and conditions for them are worsening and not improving. And I think this would be a first step in realizing what can be done to ensure that the talent and capabilities that are still present in Europe can be brought into a prosperous situation. Now, the first thing, of course, would be we need independence in certain areas. The first one is always and will ever be energy independence. There is a myth that Europe is poor in resources, but that is not true. We are not poor in resources. We are poor in exploiting resources. There is plenty of oil, gas, coal, rare earth, uranium, all the things that you would need for energy independence, for resource independence within Europe or its close periphery, right? Whether you then include Norway, the states in the Balkans, so plenty of rare earths and other things would be around. We just need to be willing to allow mining. We need to be willing to allow the construction of infrastructure. We need to abandon things like the Green New Deal and formulate an industrial policy that brings manufacturing or keeps manufacturing in Europe. Now, ideally, I would say we do this in cooperation with the United States, a kind of global burden sharing in an industrial sense. You say, okay, what are the things that would be most useful to be produced in the United States, and what things would be most useful to be produced in Europe, but then create an integrated, not just a Western hemispheric economic sphere, but a truly Western economic sphere, right? And this acceptance that, as we saw recently with rare earth and chips exports from China, that great powers are now willing to use the leverage they have and inflict pain on others. And unfortunately, at the moment, Europe does not have any kind of escalation dominance. There was a recent article in the Financial Times claiming that the United States could inflict massive economic pain on China and on the US, which is not entirely wrong, but it did kind of ignore the kind of pain that China and the US could inflict on Europe. So accepting that we are in a much more fraught and tensionful state of world politics, taking stock of where we stand, taking stock of where we have agency and where we don't have agency, I believe is a first very important step. And the kind of things that happened in the past, where we either don't take other parties seriously, like Russia, or where we underestimate dependencies, like with China, or where we don't take those who could be allies of us, but maybe are being disliked for their rhetoric, like the United States, are pillars on which we can no longer rest our foreign policy. Realpolitik, like policy that is grounded in reality, must take the cynical nature of international politics into account. And we need to start a debate of what both the national interests of European states, but also what the more general interest of Europe and the European Union as a whole truly is. And I think to start this conversation, and which will be the topic of future podcasts, to kind of outline the different areas and the different issues, is absolutely crucial for 2026. Because at the end of the day, wherever we want to go, you will not be able to ensure either the safety or economic prosperity if you remain a piece on the chessboard and not a player at the table. Thank you very much.